Texas Comptroller Glen Hegar, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. So everybody has really been talking about the Texas budget surplus, record-breaking, nearly $33 billion. You certainly created quite the stir at the Texas Capitol last month. And so now the question is, how are people going, how are the lawmakers going to be allocating that surplus? But I really wanted to ask and begin by, how do we get to this point, and what does it mean when you have nearly 33 billion extra dollars?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm glad you started off with how do we get to where we're at? If you look at the course of the last 22 months, kind of since we started coming out of the pandemic, when businesses weren't shut down, people getting back to work, the fact is here in Texas, just to put in perspective, of all the streams of revenue into the state treasury, sales tax is roughly about 60% of all the tax collections into the state treasury. So my point being is, I talk a little bit more about sales tax than other types of revenues into the state treasury of people's state treasury here in the state of Texas. The fact is we've had record numbers that have come in month after month after month. So the growth in the last year, let me put this in perspective. Total tax collections in the last 30 years in the state treasury, from 1 year compared to the prior, we've had 5 times where we've had a double-digit increase from 1 year to the next, and they range from 10 to 13%. This last year's collections was 26%, essentially almost double what we've ever had in Texas history. That was driven by strong sales tax receipts, also severance tax collections, which is oil and natural gas collections, in part because we have higher natural gas than we've had before in a decade plus. Partly that was driven by, unfortunately, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the disruption globally for natural gas. And so coming back to sales tax collections, unfortunately, you, myself, Texas businesses, individuals, unfortunately, are having to deal with record high 40-year inflation. And so why do I bring that up? I bring that in part because it also helps contribute to where we're at, because as you and I, businesses, individuals, pay more for items that are taxable, it also means revenues come in higher because of tax collections. And so just to put it in perspective, in the last month, let's say the last 3 months, in fact, Texas consumers on taxable items, that doesn't include groceries, that doesn't include medication, I'm only talking about the items that are taxable, we've essentially spent about $4.5 billion more per month than what we did in the prior year. And that's about $45 billion in a total year. So how do we get here? We got here, one, by record collections with a stronger economy than anyone had anticipated in Texas with the growth. Secondly, in part because of record high 40-year inflation. So people are paying more, unfortunately, for the same items than they did just a little over a year ago.
And, people are also expressing a lot of concern, and have been for a while, about property taxes. Their bills have, gone sky high. And a lot of it is because of rising property values. And so I'm wondering, are people overtaxed? And is the state system, when it comes to financing schools, for example, is that more reliant on the property tax than, let's say, the sales tax?
Yeah, in part, we've seen record high property valuation rises in Texas all across the state, not just, for example, in Dallas and the Metroplex and the metropolitan areas, but it's across the entire state of Texas over the course of the last year. And unfortunately, if local governments do not reduce their tax rate in accordance with higher property valuations, then people pay more. If they would reduce their tax rate in accordance with higher valuations, then the two trade off, but unfortunately that doesn't always happen. And so the legislature, as you said, with the school finance system, because the state of Texas collects no property taxes whatsoever. However, the only play that comes into part with property taxes from the state side of it is you and I pay property taxes on a local level in ISDs. You and I, as taxpayers, also pay taxes to the state, which pays part of the school system. So therefore, the legislature typically tries to drive down property tax, what people are paying on the school side of it, and counterbalance that with state revenues. And if you look at the last year, this is really what I call a once in a lifetime revenues into the state treasury. This is a historical time. We'll probably never, ever see this again. And so therefore, I think that's one reason the legislature is trying to deal with the property tax issue, and that's front and center. Whether it's the governor, lieutenant governor, the speaker, leadership, they've talked about meaningful property tax relief this session, in part because of the question that you raised.
And so far, the House and the Senate, and obviously you used to be in the Texas Senate, and they have proposed about $15 billion in property tax relief. Others say it's not high enough, needs to be higher, but to do that, they would need to break the spending cap that's in place. Is that something that you can talk about and how that would work?
Yeah, just to kind of put everything in perspective, typically for a state budget, which that's the only thing the legislature typically has to do every 2 years when they're in legislative session, is pass a 2-year state budget. And typically the amount of money that the controller says is going to come in the state treasury, that's how much they have to spend. But every once in a while, revenues have grown so strong because of the economy and now also because, unfortunately, inflation, that in fact the next limit comes into play, which is the constitutional spending limit. And so therefore the budget can only grow by a certain amount: population, inflation, personal income growth. And the point is, revenues are higher than they have to spend under that constitutional limit. And that's a good thing that we have a constitutional limit, that we can't go deficit spending like DC. But the point is, the legislature would have to vote, in part is the question, to so-called bust the constitutional spending limit. And let me just say, I've never seen a legislative body that's willing to do that. So I would seriously doubt they're going to. But what they can do, if they want, is take some of these dollars, put them in what I deem a state savings account per se, set it off to the side. While it may not get spent in this 2-year budget, they can say, we are going to dedicate this to property tax relief. We're going to dedicate this to road maintenance, highway fund, broadband infrastructure, whatever that may be. And then they can use those dollars in 2 years, 4 years, and 6 years. So they told us, we as the taxpayers, this is what we're going to dedicate it and set it aside to. While they are not spending it now, that wouldn't be busting the spending limit. What they can do is say, we're going to continue to drive down this problem, i.e. in this case that we're talking about is property taxes.
And let me ask you, and sorry if this is getting into the weeds a little bit, but one thing that we always hear is that this is the taxpayers' money.
That's right.
Not the state government's money. And yet, when you talk about the spending cap, it's on spending, and yet here you've got taxpayers' money just sitting there, and yet to give people relief, it's considered spending. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact is, I try to at least make front and center that any money that comes into the state treasury, it's the taxpayers' dollars. It's the state's budget. It's the taxpayers' budget. It's the taxpayers' government. It's the taxpayers' dollars. And so whether that's revenues coming in or expenditures, either way, it's your and my money. So the fact is the legislature has to live within those confines. Typically, it's much less than this situation, but now it's record amounts, higher than we've ever seen it in Texas history, and probably higher than we will ever see it in the future. And so therefore, one of the things they can do instead of spending is they can actually provide meaningful tax cuts. Now, whether that comes in the form of sales tax, whether it comes in the form of the business tax, the franchise tax, things that the state actually receives, that in essence is not spending, but that still drives money back into people's pockets, back in the individuals, which goes into the economy or businesses. So there's a couple ways to come about it. It doesn't have to be spending. It can be tax cuts in different forms or fashion. But since the state does not derive property taxes, the state can't just go cut property tax. The state has to swap that off some way, which typically offsets ISD spending for state spending. And therefore, that's a spending issue rather than a pure tax cut in other situations.
And so, the homestead exemption, raising the homestead exemption is often mentioned. I've also heard the Speaker of the House mention, doing something about the runaway property value assessments. So I guess could they just cap, instead of a 10% increase, cap it at 5%?
They can do a whole lot of things, and that's a discussion point that has happened in the past. That's something that undoubtedly has been discussed already. They're obviously just getting started in legislative session. So there's a lot of different things that can happen that may not necessarily be spending. It may not help you today in the tax bill that you have to pay here yet this month or last month that someone just paid. But the fact is it will help in the future, which is important to keep in perspective, I think.
And then you brought up the sales tax. Just today, the Dallas Morning News had an editorial urging lawmakers to cut the state's 6.25% sales tax. Is that something you would recommend?
So what I would recommend first and foremost, I think the state of Texas needs to deal with property tax relief, because I think that's the biggest issue that are impacting people. Secondly, I think making sure that as a state that we grow 1,000 people a day, half of that natural growth, half of that people moving here. We see that in the Metroplex every single day. We need to keep up with the road infrastructure, water infrastructure, internet infrastructure. So I think those are the core basic fundamentals of government. Now, however the legislature wants to balance that, obviously they make those decisions, but I think those are the two big components that, in my opinion, as a CFO for the state, those are the things that we have to focus on front and center. So tax relief, but I do think property taxes is the most important piece this legislative session.
And I did want to ask you about the rainy day fund, because the projection for the rainy day fund is also a record. So what is that, and how is that different from the surplus? And aren't there certain specific uses for the rainy day fund?
Yeah, so just real quick for everybody, the state's economic stabilization fund, or rainy day fund, has been into place for 34 years. It really didn't have a significant amount of money into it, because how does money go into our state savings account? Part of our oil and gas severance tax collections are dedicated to go into the economic stabilization fund. And then with the resurgence of capabilities of bringing oil out of our shale discoveries here in the state of Texas, natural gas, revenue started coming in very strong back about 10 years ago, where it had not been. And so all of a sudden, then the rainy day fund started having money into it. And the legislature, we as the voters, approved a constitutional amendment that half of the money that would be going into the rainy day fund, or state's economic stabilization fund, goes into transportation funding. Yet now the rainy day fund is projected in the next 2-year budget cycle, because of record high amounts of severance tax collections, again, with oil and gas activity, but also because of price being substantially higher in natural gas, we will hit what's called the Constitutional Economic Stabilization Fund cap in the next 2 years. And that means then those dollars wouldn't be able to go over there. We think that it's a short-term 1 or 2 year cap, and then eventually we'll outgrow that over time and be able to put more money into it. But to answer what money can be utilized for, actually, it can be any purpose the legislature may deem. It takes a 2/3 vote. So it's a higher threshold because it is your savings account than just a majority vote, but typically is meant for one significant purpose: when there's a downturn in the economy, to smooth out the edges in budgeting from one cycle to the next, like a savings account typically would be. But the legislature has also used that for emergency items, whether it's hurricanes, other natural disaster relief. And then thirdly, they may use it for one-time specific purpose that's not a reoccurring cost, such as road infrastructure, water infrastructure, or something that's really infrastructure related. Those are typically the 3 buckets the legislature has done historically and continues to stick within those confines, even though in reality, they could spend it on anything that they want if they could get a 2/3 vote. But typically they don't care to do that. They want to stick in those 3 areas.
And the rainy day fund is projected to be at the end of
Yeah, currently we have a little over $13 billion in that, substantial amount of money. But in the course of the next couple of years, because of record amounts and one-time events of sending money into it that we haven't ever had really in Texas history of substantial amount, that fund is projected in 2 years from now to have a little almost 26 billion, and I didn't stutter, $26 billion in it.
It's amazing when you think about it, 26 billion and then 33 billion. I know you can't really add the two, but still, I mean, that's sizable amounts of money.
Well, especially when you consider, and I made the point here last month when I was reading an article about, Saudi Arabia announcing they had a little over a I think a $27 billion surplus. And I told my staff, I said, well, that's great for them. We have over 30. Or if you look at California, that has literally a $25 billion deficit right now, and Texas is completely the opposite. And so therefore it is substantial what's happened in Texas, part the economy, but unfortunately also continuing to recognize that people unfortunately are paying higher prices than they had before. And that means more revenues into the state, as people are unfortunately having to pay more for the same items than they did over a year ago.
Well, we appreciate the conversation very much. Texas Comptroller Glen Hegar, thank you very much.
Always good to be with you.
You take care.